What is the notion of time?
One of the things that is a way to move from a omniscient way of thinking about it to an immanent way of thinking about it can include the notion of time particularly. We normally think of time as being that context within which events occur. The kind of time that we could structure on a calendar, right? I can have a month represented as a series of boxes, and I can put events of meetings in those boxes. And this is, of course, very convenient for the modern world. Um, but in the way the metaphysics thinks about time, it's not starting from a omniscient view of it. It's starting from an immanent view of that, which is a little bit more like Indian time. I'll get there whenever I get there, right? But really, what that's speaking to is that as we go more into the notion of the immanent, we begin to notice that events can't be thought of not so much as having been occurring in time, but that the notion of time is occurring in events, i.e., that the very sense of change comes out of the experience of the event. And so, in effect, the idea of time is always a first person experience. Right? When I look at even a clock, it's the changing of the clock that gives me the sense that time's passing. But if it wasn't for the firsthand experience of that change, then I wouldn't know that time was passing. So, in other words, there has to be an event for there to be time in a first person way. So, in this specific sense, we're basically saying time is an aspect of events, not the container in which events occur. I don't have to assume anything about whether or not time is flowing linearly, or maybe it's making some weird curve on a plane. I don't even have to imagine the notion of a plane. I can only think, I can think purely in terms of just here and now, and the experience that the past and the future feel different. And that's an essential point. It helps us to relate to time differently. And we want to relate to it differently because it's in that difference that things like Axiom 2 are going to make more sense. So let's just use this as essentially an introduction, right? So if you look at the literal text of Axiom 2, it says something like a class of the transcendent precedes an instance of the immanent, a class of the immanent, and so on, right? Well, what are we talking about when we say, for example, a class of the omniscient precedes an instance of the transcendent? Or, any of these particular things where we have out of many one, right? So we're seeing out of many one three times over, one for each mode to the next. In effect, there's a sense here in which, even talking about Axiom 2 requires a kind of simultaneity, but unfortunately I don't have that. So I'm going to have to lay it out sequentially. When I'm thinking about past, present, and future, let's live in the present for a moment and notice that in order for this present to be a present as a singularity, that to some extent, if I'm like wanting to take sort of an overview of like a theory of how did I get here, right? So going from the first person to the third person again, you know, what is the thing that we could sort of notice? Well, there were a lot of pasts. There's a lot of past events, all of which are prior to the present moment. Is the present moment, if we're going to say that the present is in some way contingent on the past, right? Again, using this sort of third person perspective as a way of thinking about this, which of course is now temporary, because I'm trying to construct scaffolding for how to think about Axiom 2. But obviously, we're coming from a Western mindset, so let's build some scaffolding here, right? So in a sense, we could say, okay, the present moment, that every specific aspect of the present moment is the result of a plurality of things that happened in the past. Like, for example, we're on a Zoom call. Well, what are all the things that have to happen for this Zoom call to be here? Well, there's my computer and all the hardware, and of course all the manufacturing that went into that, and your computer, and then the whole internet, and of course a lot of people have to be doing a lot of maintenance all over the world in order for that to occur. So the singularity of you're getting to hear my voice is coming out of the plurality of all of these things that we think of as the past. And I see this thing about past is omniscient and present is imminent. Right. Yes, it definitely looks like it's going backwards. Now, in this specific sense, we can make an observation, though, that there's a sort of plurality to singularity flow that is happening. Right. That in effect there's this sense of one to many relationships, because it's also the case, if we think about it from again a third person perspective, that out of this present moment a whole bunch of futures will flow, right? The things that are happening here are enabling an entire plurality of possible futures. Each of you can make all sorts of different choices on the basis of what you could do, on the basis of what you've learned here today, or at least hopefully that's the outcome. I mean, we'll see when we get there, right? But the idea here is that there is, out of the plurality of our communication events, the future possibility of new choices. Right? You have to learn a whole bunch of things in order to get those new choices. And again, I'm not trying to correspond all of this directly in Axiom 2 just yet, right? I'm basically just trying to give you a sense as to what I mean by the plural to the singular, as a kind of dynamic. Now, you may have noticed, as I'm sure all of you have sort of had some from your comments, that really if I have three modes and they're connected together in a ring, there's really only two ways to draw that ring. It's either going to go clockwise or counterclockwise, however I label the nodes. So first of all, I would have you notice that just from a strictly possibility sense, that if I have three things connected with lines, it makes a circle or a triangle, and that's from a topological perspective, basically the same as a circle, right? It's a ring of some sort. And there's really only two ways that ring's going to go, one way or the other. Right? If I had a lot more nodes, then I can have a lot more directions that I could have it go, a lot more ways of drawing rings in multiple things. But if we're dealing with something that is essentially the simplest possible ring, then in effect, there's two directions. So the main question that could be asked, well, why would we prefer one flow over the other? Why is it that there's essentially a preferred sequencing? And it's the same kind of thing that could be asked about Axiom 1, like why would we say that the immanent is more fundamental than the omniscient and or the transcendent? I use the word clockwise as a convention, just to distinguish that there's only two flows, right? Which way are the hands going to go on a clock, one way or the other, right? So in effect, I say clockwise mostly out of tradition. If I basically label immanent, omniscient, transcendent in a clockwise ring, then I've created a sort of convention for us to relate to. And again, if believe me, it's a convention in the sense that it's a perspective, right? If I take a sheet of paper, right? Say I've got this sheet of paper and I put immanent, omniscient, transcendent, but then I flip the paper over, like I turn this around. I'm now looking at it from the other way. You'll notice the direction's now counterclockwise. It's the same ring. So to some extent, what we're noticing is that part of the nature of Axiom 2 is that the distinction between past, present, and future is oriented. The same way that here and there is oriented. And what has happened versus what might have happened is oriented. And these things occur together, by the way, right? So for instance, I'm pointing out that in the same sense that the arrow of time is oriented from the first person point of view, the distinction between subjective and objective is oriented from a first person point of view. And the thing that could have happened versus the thing that did happen is oriented from a first person point of view. So in this specific sense, if I'm basically taking a first person point of view as essentially fundamental, and I'm letting go of the omniscient way of thinking about it, right? So I'm gonna move past or away from the notion of that the present has come out of the past as the third person way of thinking about it. I could actually say, well, the present is essentially the potential of the future that is possible coming into the actual. Sit with that a minute, right? That in effect, that the present moment is an actuality that is emerging out of the field of potentiality. Right? In the same sense that time's oriented, there's an orientation of unmanifest becoming manifest. And this is an exactly backwards way of thinking about time relative to an omniscient frame. In an immanent frame, the present emerges out of the future. I see some of you nodding. Those that are not yet nodding, sit with this a minute, because you'll see that from a first person perspective, it can't be otherwise. How did the present moment get to be here? Well, it's like any other process of manifestation in the here and now. Possibilities, the probability of the possible emerges into the actuality. That which is not yet known becomes known. So in a sense, what we're really talking about is out of the plurality of possible things that could happen, usually the most probable thing does happen. And we notice it as happening in the here and now. We certainly didn't notice it in the there and then because we're in the here and now. I can't make choices tomorrow or choices yesterday. I can only make choices now. And the causation of what happened tomorrow and the causation of what happened yesterday, those are invisible to me. I don't see those. I only see the projections of them from the here and now. I don't see yesterday. I have the memory of yesterday, and I have a hypothesis about how I might construct a memory or construct a meaningfulness out of the memory. The memory is here and now, but there's nothing I can do, modulo a few exotic corrections, but for the most part, there's nothing I can do to change the past. Right? The past seems fixed, but that's a projection of how we see it from the here and now. In the same sort of way that we talked about how physics has to view the universe in the disconnected way, that from a first person point of view, we end up having to see the universe in a connected way, that the notion of the distinction between subject and object, past and future, and here and there. What I would love to essentially do at this point is just to basically notice that, in effect, we're now talking about a first person point of view and how it changes how we think about the relationship between past, present, and future. From a first person point of view, we're noticing that we are hypothesizing the existence or absence thereof, right? Because existence is a third person concept, right? That the only thing we know for sure is what's happening here and now. And everything else is essentially a hypothesis. Now, those might be good hypotheses, they might be useful hypotheses, but nonetheless, they're not direct experiences. They're indirect experiences. The present pulls the future into the past. That's right. That's how you get it. But even that way of thinking about it, notice that that's a little bit still, like it's a modeling of the whole phenomenon, right? As if I'm standing outside of it. But in effect, if I'm standing inside of it, I see the plurality of potentialities becoming the singularity of what happens, what actual is. And out of the pluralities of what is actual comes the singularity of a future potential.